if you've got your Bible, turn to the book of 1 Kings. All right, I did not give you an outline this week, and I have somewhat of an outline-less sermon. Is that a word? Outlineless? Let's make it a word, all right? Outlineless. So I don't have a point 1, 2, or 3, so I may just rattle on, and we'll just pick up what you can, all right? It's like scattering food or something, where it's a buffet. Just get what tastes good or whatever. Let me ask you a question, though, as you're turning to 1 Kings. I'm not going to tell you what chapter yet or anything, but have you ever had experience in life? Probably every one of us have. I've had it over and over and over. A time in life where you're a case of mistaken identity. Situation maybe where you've been talking to someone or something and you got the wrong person or the wrong name with the wrong person. I do that stuff all the time. I try to get people's names and I mix them up sometimes, not too bad though. Those I'm real familiar with, I don't have too much of a problem with, and I try to say the names just to keep in practice and everything, but I'm not beyond putting the wrong name with the wrong face. I met a guy at a restaurant yesterday, in fact, and as I saw him walk in the room, I recognized him. And so I thought, well, I know who he is. It's not someone I know. I don't know that I ever personally met him, but I've heard him sing before over in Sand Springs. And so as he approached, I said, well, hi, Charles. And his name is not Charles. Anyways, so I had the wrong name, and so he corrected the name. And I said, okay, well, I do know who you are. I've heard you sing before and whatever. And saving grace was that he didn't know who I was either. So anyways, no, it was only like a week before that. In fact, it was at the same restaurant. And as I was there, I recognized, well, I didn't recognize a couple men sitting at a booth nearby. And because I just didn't glance over there really. And sure enough, I knew both of them. And they recognized me, and so as they got up to leave, they had to walk by their table, and so I probably looked and stared right past him, and he may have waved or something, I don't know, but I never did acknowledge him. As soon as he started walking towards me, I recognized the one, and lit up and said, hey, how you doing? And I didn't call him by name, so I'm pretty sure I knew his name, but I didn't want to chance it. And so then he said, well, you remember, and I didn't recognize the other guy at all. So I did know him, and I didn't know him real well, but I've known him from years past, not at Canyon Road. And so anyways, mistaken identity, it happens quite often. The other kind of thing that happens, if you've ever had this happen, is the phone rings, you pick up and say hello, and someone just starts talking, assuming you know who they are. Doesn't that just bug you? So what do you start doing? You start thinking, okay, I've got to tone of voice. I can recognize that voice, and it's kind of hard. You know, some people have distinct voices, some people don't. And so that may not help you out. So then you start listening to the content of what they're saying. Listen for a buzzword. Listen for them to drop a name or something of someone else so you can associate them with something or think of what they're calling for. Finally, you're almost embarrassed to say, who is this? You know? I sent a long text one time to someone in our church that just, I heard you're having whatever, just praying for you like that. And finally I got a text back that says, well, I don't know who this is, but you know, it's like, well, it's your pastor. You know, you put me in your caller ID so you know when I call or text, it's me. I shouldn't have to identify myself. But I try a lot of times to say, this is Pastor Mike, even if I think you know who it is or something like that. Anyways, mistaken identity. It happens, and it happens on a casual basis all the time. But even worse than missing someone's name or misidentifying someone. So if I were to dye my hair, bleach it blonde or something like that, or get it all cut off or grow it long or something like that. If you ever watch Undercover Boss, I use that as an illustration. I don't watch it a lot, but I like to watch it. And one of the things I like the show, but one thing I don't like about the show is the stupid costumes they put the bosses in to disguise them. I think, well, that'd be my first giveaway, because no one looks like that naturally, you know. And besides, they're being followed around by a camera. If you've ever heard of the show before, you're going to know this is what this is. It's a setup or whatever. But I kind of watch skeptical to see if I can tell if they really know that it's the CEO of the company or not, or something like that. But they put those stupid wigs on and all that kind of stuff. And we can disguise ourselves sometimes, and people may not recognize us. But the other thing is not recognizing what someone has done. If you've ever had someone has done something and you don't know who did it. whether it's good or bad. Maybe someone cleaned up their room, you know. As a teenager, you would never guess. No, I'm just kidding. Someone broke into our house, went into my teenager's room and cleaned it up. So I know my teenager would do that. I'm just kidding. Teenagers can't clean it, right? All right. So yeah, someone took out the trash and it could have been my husband because I didn't ask him 20 times, right? That kind of thing. I'm thinking on people now. We'll stop that. But anyways, not recognizing what someone has done or who did it by the nature of what they've done. Other times you can go, oh, well, I know who must have done this because, can I say it? They always leave the toilet seat up. So I know who did that. You know, see, I said I was going to stop and I didn't. I should have stopped before that one. All right. Well, let me talk to you about a man named Elijah. Who's ever heard of Elijah? Of course, we all have, I think. All right. Old Testament prophet. Elijah's a man in a situation of some mistaken identity. Not that he was mistaken, but guess who he didn't recognize? God. Oh, he had recognized him in the past. He knew God very well. He was employed by him, if you want to look at it that way. Elijah was God's man. Elijah spent time with God. But in the 19th chapter of 1 Kings, we find Elijah in a situation that maybe we can identify. That sometimes we miss God. Sometimes we don't see either who God is or that it is God that is there. Or sometimes we just don't understand that what is happening around us is God at work. Or God, and I'd have to say probably purposely not at work, or at least not doing something for a purpose. Because if God chooses to do nothing in a situation, He's actively doing nothing. It's for a purpose. And I didn't get any amens on that. I have to think about that. If God is not doing something, it's on purpose, correct? Or if it seems as though He's not doing something, it's on purpose. Well, Elijah, and I want to give a little background, and I want to give you a few illustrations in the New Testament so we can come back and maybe appreciate Elijah's scenario of this mistaken identity, because he wasn't just sitting in a restaurant and didn't notice God sitting in the other booth. It wasn't that simple. His name didn't just have a block and all of a sudden, and God was not in a silly wig. All right? So maybe if we can understand this, we can relate to Elijah's situation and maybe learn something for ourselves concerning this situation he's at. Elijah was having a D-Now weekend. All right, you guys had a D-Now weekend last weekend. Our youth were gone to Talamina or Talahina? What's that? Talahina. Not on the Talamina Drive, but Talahina, the town. Okay, anyways, they were at a camp. They were at a Disciple Now weekend. And Elijah was having a Disciple Now weekend. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. If you go to, hold your place in 1 Kings 13, but go to Matthew, the 14th chapter. Matthew 14, started to turn to it, and that's where I'm at, so I can just stay right here. All right. Elijah was having kind of a little bit of a scenario in this episode that he has in his story in the 19th chapter of 1 Kings. But in Matthew chapter 14, we have a situation that you remember. Jesus had just fed the multitude. It was a miracle that took place, drew a lot of attention, all that. The story goes as he finished that miracle, he sent his disciples on across the Sea of Galilee. He put them in a boat and set them adrift. And he stayed behind. The crowd left. He sent them away. He stayed behind to pray. And so that separated him from his disciples, which didn't happen very often. They were always usually there together. And so they were separated, and he prayed, and then he got up and he went to his disciples. Well, the Sea of Galilee, not a huge body of water, but big enough to where, you don't just zip across it. No power motors, no nothing like that. So it was a journey that was taking them. They were going into a headwind, you can call it that, or the wind was working against them. In fact, it came up a storm there on the Sea of Galilee. And there they were, his disciples out on the water in a boat about to get capsized, really. And so we pick up in that story right there. And in the midst of the storm, and we can relate to that. I talk about it a lot because it seems like every other day or every other week at least, I'm in the midst of a storm. Or there's storms all around us. We face those kind of situations. So realize They were in the midst of a challenging situation, a scary situation, an unsure situation, and they had been separated from the Lord, and that was uneasy in and of itself. However, that changed in verse 25. In verse 25, it says, now around 3 in the morning. How many of y'all are real coherent at 3 in the morning? Yeah, some of you all are. That's right. That'd be your time. Yeah, come on, Lord. 3 in the morning, all right? Others go, I don't even know myself at 3 in the morning, let alone someone else, all right? But at 3 in the morning, it just happened to be, so think of it, pitch black, unless they have their little lantern with a candle burning or something like that, so it's pitch black, and the wind's blowing, the boat's about to be capsized. According to this, there's other storms and other storm stories that we get confused here, but here it did say the waves were crashing against the boat, so they were frightened. They were already nervous and unsettled in this situation they were in. And around 3 in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the sea. So that's the Sea of Galilee. So he comes out there walking on the water. Did they recognize him? They did not. You know the story. As he approaches there, it says they were terrified, and their comment was, it's a ghost. We're seeing something and it's a ghost. So they interpreted their situation as even scarier than it was already. Then they see this figure walking on the thing. Now some weird supernatural thing is taking place, and they thought it was a ghost. And who are they calling a ghost? Jesus. They were missing the miracle because they were afraid. They were missing the miracle because of their situation, and their attention was on the wind and the water and that kind of thing. They were missed that it was Jesus because they had been separated from him, and they never thought this would happen. They knew there wasn't another boat there, so they didn't, expect him to come up in a boat. They'd either miss him until the next day or something when he could walk around the Sea of Galilee and meet up with them in a day or two. So they did not expect him, and so they missed him. Fear is one of the reasons we mistake the identity of God and miss Jesus and his presence with us because of fear. Let me tell you, I like these little confirmation things because they just help reassure me as I thought, well, what sermon am I going to do to follow up on a 3-part sermon, 3-part series and that we've been doing, Drawing Near to God and everything. So I thought, well, what do I do this week? And so this is what I felt led to preach. And as I did that, let me tell you, last night I remembered a song and I wrote it down on a piece of paper right here, and I wrote, "Fear is a liar." How many know that song? It's a contemporary song. It's not in the hymn book. It's a contemporary song. It's a good song. And I wrote that down last night. This morning I get ready to come to church. I've had this happen to me so many times. And on the way to church, I'm pulling out of our audition. We're all nice and quiet, and I turn the radio on to KXOJ. And immediately, guess what song begins to play? Out of all the songs that could be playing at 6:30 in the morning, pitch black, and I turn the radio on, and the very first song that starts playing, and I didn't recognize it at first, to think, oh my goodness, that's the song, "Fear is a Liar." And that's what I wrote down on that piece of paper, and that's what we're talking about today. Fear is a liar. So I listened to it all the way to church, just going, thank you, Lord, for just kind of confirming I got the right direction. That's cool enough. Amen. But then I come in here and I start making coffee. I go to the fellowship hall first thing, and I start making my coffee. I got a little routine going, so I get a little coffee going, stuff like that. I like music around, and so I decide to go start the music. So I go over and I plug the radio in. Now I've got CDs in there. There's several CDs that stack up. This is what happens every time, I plug it in, it automatically goes to CD number 1, and I already know that because it's been over there for a while, and so I know I don't care for the first song. It's a little bit rowdy for me at 6:30 in the morning, and so I just kind of got in the habit that I plug it in, let it get ready, I wait for it to click on the CD number 1, I hit play, and as soon as I hit the play button, I hit skip to song 2, all right? I did that just as a habit. I walk away from the CD and I realize I should have recognized this because I've been doing it a bunch, but I didn't recognize, guess what song is number 2, not on the radio, but on the CD that I played right after hearing that song all the way to the church. Fear is a liar. I don't need a third time to say. Well, that really was a third time. First, write it down, Mike, so I wrote it down. Here on the way to the church, here to the fellowship hall, I go, okay, we're on target. Fear is a liar. Fear is a liar. Fear is a liar. Fear comes from God. God has not given us a spirit of fear, has He? So if we have a spirit of fear, if we're afraid of our situation, does that come from God? No. No. Now the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, amen? The fear of God is, so that's a different kind of fear. That's a reverence and a respect. And God will gladly allow that fear and that respect for Him to create wisdom in our life. But the bad kind of fear that comes from the one that would cause us to be afraid of a situation in our life, that kind of fear is a liar, and it comes from the father of lies. And so I love that song and love it even more now. So we have a situation here where we have the disciples and they don't recognize Jesus, even go as far as to call Him a ghost. And that's because they did not recognize Him, because they were afraid. And they were afraid of their situation. And they were blind to the possibility that this all fit into a purpose. They were blind to the possibility that they might not die in that boat, but that they may weather the storm and Jesus would help them out. They were absolutely unaware that Jesus was approaching them. And when we're in a situation that we face and we get a little bit of that fear trying to come up, we need to rebuke that. Amen? We need to rebuke that fear. I'll tell you the whole scenario. I run into a situation earlier this past week. And as I was approaching the situation, that fear began to well up inside of me. And it kept being reestablished and reconfirmed. And it was really bothering me. So I began to sing a song that I was familiar with. It was a song that came to me, "My only hope is in you, Jesus. My only hope is in you. From early in the morning till late at night, my only hope is you." Amen. I began to sing that, and guess what? A visual came up, not a pretend visual. It was actually not a coffin, but the what do you call the vault that holds a coffin? Drove past me. Now, how often do you drive past a vault? Driving down the road, on the back of a flatbed. And it was that same fear of what I was perhaps facing. And that fear began to creep up. And I pointed at that and I said, no fear, no. And I began to sing that song. And I just repeated that song over and over and over. And the Lord got me through that situation, and I did not have to face what I possibly was going to face. And you just keep on moving. But it's so easy not to do that, and not to recognize that, and not to think I need to overcome that kind of fear. So Elijah was having a D-Now weekend. He was having that kind of a weekend where he, because of his situation, we'll talk about in just a minute. He's not the only one. We can have instant after instance. There's a thing, you don't need to turn to it if you don't want to, but Luke chapter 24 is the story about after Jesus' resurrection, the two men on the road to Emmaus. How many of y'all remember that story? Two men on the road to Emmaus. And the bottom line of that story is Jesus come along beside them as they're walking home on their way to Emmaus. And He's talking with them, and guess what? They are feet, or literally inches away from the resurrected Jesus in His glorified body, and they do not recognize Him. I don't know that one could be contributed to fear, but perhaps so, because that was a fearful time for those who believed in Christ. He'd been crucified, or all their hopes dashed, or whatever. But in the confusion of their situation and all the talk, they were talking about what everybody's thinking and talking what's going to happen, and they weren't a part of the apostles. They were kind of huddled together and gathering and trying to do that. These were just two believers that were on the road to Emmaus. And it wasn't until Jesus revealed Himself, you remember the story, that they then realized we're talking with Jesus, and did not even recognize Him. And I wouldn't even say that He was in a costume. He wasn't, even in His glorified body, He was recognizable, wasn't He? But He had not revealed Himself to them. And so there they were. Jesus was in the midst of them, and He was working in their situation, and He was working in the bigger picture as well, and they didn't even notice. They didn't recognize Jesus. Another example, realize that this kind of thing happens in very different situations quite often. And we go to John chapter 4. And in John chapter 4, another familiar story that I love to teach and preach and talk about, a real life happening at Jacob's well. And at Jacob's well, there was a woman that came to get water. We call her the Samaritan woman. And the whole story is fascinating. It's incredible. Jesus is alone there because the disciples have gone in town to get food. And as he was alone there, this woman approaches this man. Not a good situation either. Unsettling because it was inappropriate for a woman to talk to a man in public like that, alone. That would not be acceptable. And so and it was, it was just not the best of scenarios from her perspective. So she probably was a little bit nervous. Nonetheless, she also did not recognize that it was Jesus. And he was right there. And he was talking to her and conversing with her. And in the course of the conversation, we come across verse 20, hold on, I get some glasses here. Verse 25. In verse 25, towards the end of their discussion, the woman said, "I know that Messiah is coming." So that she's a believer as a Jew, being Samaritan, half Jew, half Gentile. But she was aware of that, and she said, "I know Messiah is coming." That fit into the conversation that they were having. The one who is called Christ. And when he comes, there she is talking to him. When he comes, he'll explain everything to us. Well, he was trying to explain some things to her about life. He was at work in her life. This was a divine appointment that was set up from the foundations of the earth. This was no accident. She had encountered Christ one-on-one. You know how few people got to encounter Christ one-on-one like that? Just a handful of people, really. Because usually it was his disciples, and usually it was either his family or the crowds around and all that kind of stuff. And there she was, talking to Jesus, not knowing his identity. Not knowing that he was who he was. And there she was even talking about him to him. I've done that one. I've done that before where the person I'm talking to, I start talking about the person I think and not realizing I'm talking about, I don't even want to get into the story. I got into weird, awkward situations like that, and they go, "Excuse me, that's me," It's like, okay. And so there she was. And here's what he says, "I am he," in verse 26. I am he. He clarifies, this is me. The one that you're talking to is the Messiah that you're speaking of. The one that would be called Christ, that is me. And he begins to work in her life. And this encounter with him changes not only her life, but the life of that town. She ran back and told everyone that she had this encounter with Messiah. And if you want to see yourself, go check it out. So some believed based on her testimony, and many others went out and had their own encounter with Christ, and they believed. And the entire town was affected because of a chance meeting, even though there was mistaken identity. So we see that throughout Scripture, that quite often when God is at work, we don't recognize it. For various reasons. Fear is not the only reason, but fear is a real one. And fear is a crippling one that we don't recognize. And really what it is in our situation. Fear comes up within a situation. And we get focused on the storm, we get focused on the situation, and we forget to look for Jesus. We forget to look for God, and therefore our eyes are off of Him, and our eyes are on the storm. Peter walking on water, and that same disciple in that weekend thing that was happening just a few minutes ago. Well, let's look into this situation with Elijah, and just appreciate Elijah, Old Testament prophet, and the situation that he was in, and see how it is that he finally understood that God was at work in what he was doing. It comes in the middle of a big story, starting in the first of chapter 19. It starts talking about Ahab and Jezebel. And Ahab was the king of Israel. He was a bad king. He was an evil king. In fact, back in chapter, I believe it's 16, back in chapter 16, verse 30, it says, "But Ahab, son of Omri, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord." He had continued, but even made worse, the worship of Baal. One of the worst things the people of God can do is to have a false god. God is a jealous God, and God is the only true God. And we need to recognize Him as the only God and our only hope. And when Israel had sinned in such a gross way to begin to worship Baal as a false god, then that presented a judgment upon them. That Elijah, unfortunately, was going to be the spokesman for this judgment against Israel. So he was witnessing a bad day in the nation of Israel. And the chapter before is where he obviously was where he was supposed to be and knew what God was doing, knew that God was unhappy, knew that judgment was coming. He was on the top of Mount Carmel, and I have stood in the very spot where he had built that altar. And he said, okay, let's just do this. You remember the story in chapter 18. Let's do this. You worship Baal. Let's see what Baal can do. Let's see what Jehovah God can do. And so they built their altar and prayed for the fire to come down and consume it. And no fire came down. Because Baal's a false god. He can't do the things that God can do. And so then it was Elijah's turn, and in chapter 18, he proves that he knows God, and he proves that he knows the power of God, and he goes a step further and doesn't just build an altar and let God send the fire and burn it down, but what happens? He digs a trench around it, and he says, now go get 4 gallons of water and douse the wood and douse the sacrifice that was put on the altar. And the water ran down. He says, now go do it again. And they doused 4 more gallons of water on the wood. And it was sopping wet and began to fill up that trench. He says, do it a 3rd time. And so they go and they get 4 more gallons of water and they drench it on here. Now everything's soaked up and there's water even in the trench. And now it's supposed to burn. And he calls down fire, and fire consumes the altar. Every bit of it, even licking up the water around the trench. God proves himself, and Elijah proves that he knows who God is. What's so fascinating about that is that had just occurred in his life. And it wouldn't be the last miracle that he sees in this stage of his life. And yet, even as on target as he can be, he was still susceptible, just like you and I are, to giving into fear and to struggle and to get our eyes off of God and the power of God in our situation and give up hope. So that's the situation coming in. Because after he did that, if you read the story, if you don't, read it because it's a little bit disturbing. He doesn't just say, aha, I was right and you're wrong. He goes, God is God and Baal is not, and your false prophets that led the people in this worship, meet me back in the alley, kind of, you'd say back in the alley. And he killed every one of those prophets. Killed all of the false prophets. It was a horrible day. But there was judgment on them, and they were judged for what they had led the people into. And then Jezebel tells Ahab what had taken place. That's the fascinating part we step into this story. Verse 1 of 19, I want to get the main part I want to get to is a little bit further down, but I want us to lead into this. It says Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done, and how that he had killed the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a message to Elijah. You ever get a text message that's disturbing? This wasn't a text message. It was handwritten, all right? Jezebel's, the evil Jezebel, all right, that Ahab had married. Sends this message to Elijah saying, "My God, may the God, small g, may the gods punish me and do severely if I do not make your life just like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Their life was ended. And he says, may I be judged if you're not dead too. Elijah, I'm going to kill you. Or I'm going to have you killed. All right? You're going to be dead by this time tomorrow. Now, Elijah is in this situation. He has just seen the power of God. He has just proven hundreds of false prophets wrong. He has just been an avenue for a miracle of God to show his power over any situation, even if you make the situation as uncertain as you can for the outcome that actually happens, and yet he finds himself in this situation. So you would almost expect Elijah, knowing he's a prophet of God, knowing his history, knowing the situation right now, to just say, well, hey, if God be for me, he can be against me. I have nothing to fear, we got the story of David and Daniel in the lion's den. We have the story of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego in the furnace. We have all these proofs that God can overcome any circumstances. So surely Elijah's going to just stand strong. 4 weeks ago I preached that, didn't I? Stand up. Just take your stand. Put on their own blood and take your stand. Verse 3. Then Elijah, there it happened. Then Elijah became afraid. Fear is a liar. In that moment, he listened to a lie. And fear creeped its ugly head up, and he became afraid. How do we behave when we become afraid? Not full of faith, not full of trust, but we panic and we get scared. And we realize our own weaknesses and all that. And immediately he ran for his life. Here's the man of God that just stood up for God and passed the test, and God proved himself, and now he's running for his life because of Jezebel, because of Ahab, because of his situation. Ran for his life, and it says when he came to Beersheba, it was a pretty good distance away, that belonged to Judah, so it's right on the edge of Judah, about 100 miles south of Mount Carmel, if I got it right. Anyways, he left his servant there. Now, I find something significant about that. Elijah had men that traveled with him and that kind of stuff. And he leaves his servant there. Do you realize what just happened? Elijah, who is now afraid and fearful and running for his life, is now alone. What's worse than being afraid? Being afraid and alone. And we know that God's always with us, amen? So we're never alone. But if we don't see God, don't recognize Him, don't identify Him, then we think we're all alone. So realize that's what that's saying. So he left his servant there, but he went a day's journey into the wilderness, and he sat down under a broom tree. And he prayed that night that he might die. See where he's at? He's afraid. He's alone. He's given up hope. He sees the situation, and the lie says there's no getting out of this. It's beyond repairable. It's not just, and we realize that in his situation, it's not just his life alone. It's all of Israel and all this mess and all this, trouble that has been going on and all this kind of stuff. So he just takes it all on his shoulders and said, it's beyond repair. He gives up hope, and he just hopes to die. Okay? He's not going to end his life, but he just sure hopes it does end. All right? So he sits under that tree, get a little shade there, and in his hopelessness and exhaustion and defeatist attitude and lack of hope, he just falls asleep. And that's not a good sleep, by the way. That's not like, I get to rest. All right. But he falls asleep. This is where it gets a little bit strange in my mind, but interesting anyways. So he hopes to die, and he said, I have had enough. Have you ever had enough? I'm reading Coleman translation, I don't know what yours says, but he says, I have had enough, Lord. He's talking to God. Remember, the Samaritan woman was talking to God. The disciples were talking towards God, towards Jesus, and calling him a ghost. The men to Emmaus were talking to Jesus, but did not recognize him. And so he's talking to the Lord, but he's obviously not in tune with the Lord, and he's not focused on the Lord, but he's just calling out to God from a distance in his mind, take my life, for it's better, that I am no better than my father's. It's inevitable. And just take my life. So then in verse 5 he says, then he laid down and he slept under the broom tree. Suddenly an angel touched him. Now, as bizarre as that seems and everything, just realize this. In the midst of a horrible situation, granted it is, in a difficult time in Elijah's life, God's at work. God's at work. And God's not beyond whatever He needs to do or whatever. And He'll send an angel or a whole host of angels or not, or send someone else, or do something, whatever it takes, He'll do it. And so suddenly an angel touched him. If you've ever been asleep and all of a sudden someone touches you and wakes you up, it's startling, isn't it? He's already afraid. He's already given up hope. He's scared, and he's alone, and thinks he's alone, and all of a sudden an angel touches him. And the angel just says this, get up and eat. Get up and eat. And his immediate response was, McDonald's is like 5 miles away and I'm too tired. And I don't like their food anyways. Get up and eat. What are you talking about? Get up and eat. So he looks down there, and there at his head was a loaf of bread baked over the stone and a jug of water. How weird, how cool that God would get his attention in at such a devastating time and yet meet a very real need. Have you ever been worried about a situation and you forget to eat? You forget to take care of yourself? You don't realize what's happening to your body because of the stress and the worry? And then you add on top of that the hopelessness and the feeling all alone. You don't feel like God's abandoned you or anything like that. It'll wreck your body. God knew that. God created Elijah. So he didn't just send an angel to get his attention. He also provides for a need. God is still working miracles. God is still doing incredible things, but he's not recognizing what's happening. Okay, where do we go? So he looks up that, and so Scripture says he ate and he drank and then he laid down again. Met the need, but he's still exhausted. He just doesn't know what's going on around him. Then the angel of the Lord returned for a second time and touched him again. He said, "Get up and eat, or your journey will be too much for you." See, what that tells us is God not only is getting his attention, but he's saying, your journey, it's not over. This is not how your journey ends. This is not over. You've got a journey to take, and you're going to need your strength. You're going to need food. You're going to need water. You're going to need the rest that you're getting right now, but you need to realize you've got a purpose and a plan. God is at work. He still doesn't quite understand it. So, but he gets up, and in verse 9, he says, so he gets up, and he ate, and he drank, and then then on the strength from the food, this is fascinating, he walked, are you reading along? 40 days and 40 nights. Are you ever tired of being tired and think, I can't even get up out of bed today? And yet the Lord does give you the strength, but he gives him the strength to take a 40-day journey. I want us to be real about this. That means if that happened to you, let's say here's the broom tree and you're laying down there, the angel touches you, you get up, eat, drink, you do, you go back to sleep the second time, you get up and you need your strength for the journey ahead. What journey? What journey? Trust me, there's a journey ahead. And all of a sudden you get up and you start walking. Today is March 25th. If you started walking today and you walked for 40 days and 40 nights, you're into the month of May. The month of May. Your April is gone. Forget yard work. Forget Easter preparation and all that kind of stuff. You'll be walking from today until the first part of May. That's a journey. That's a journey. Why would God do that? Because God's at work in his life, and it's not over. But he's not in the best of situation, but he provides for him physically. All right. So he does that. Now we get to our part. Now, even after he saw what happened on Mount Carmel, even after he's touched by an angel, not once but twice, even after he eats food and drinks water that is provided by God, the creator of the earth, all right? Or by this angel, however he did that. Even after he survives a 40-day journey. Watch mistaken identity. Then the word of the Lord came to him. The Lord's talking directly to him. And he said in verse, whatever that is, verse 9. Then the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? God doesn't talk to you that way. Kind of get your attention and say, what are you doing? How'd you get in this situation? Why are you here? God always has a purpose for everything. God has a purpose for everything. We don't. We wander in the wilderness. We struggle. We go places we shouldn't go. We give in spiritually, emotionally, whatever, and we give up. We get into places that we shouldn't be. And we forget why we even are breathing and what God is doing in your life. And we don't even recognize him. God's trying to talk to him because he's got very important things for him to do. He's got very important things for you to do as well. So he replies. Now listen to his reply. Think of Elijah. Think of where he is in the situation. Think of him. He's just a man like you and I, just a regular person in a position and all that. But he replies by saying, I have been very zealous for you, Lord God of hosts. But the Israelites have abandoned your covenant. They've torn down your altars, and they have killed your prophets. He's not talking about the false prophets. He's talking about the prophets that God has sent to give the word of the Lord. And he says they've killed them with the sword. I alone, get this, I alone am left. And now they're looking for me to take my life. God, you see, you just don't understand the situation. You just don't understand, God. Let me tell you, because you don't understand. Nothing is worked out. When you get afraid, when you get to running for your life instead of running in life, to live life, things happen to you that aren't right. Your perspectives get skewed. You don't understand you have a purpose. You forget that God is able to do all things. All right? And here he is thinking, now here's what we know, because he's not all alone. Elijah said, I am the one person alone who has not turned his back on you, God. You're lucky to have me. Let me tell you, I'm a mess. But at least I didn't turn away from you. I am asking you to just go ahead and take my life because I'm worthless. The situation's worthless. I stand alone. I'm done. I'm tired. I can't do it anymore. This is not a good situation to be in. But guess what? You may feel that way. You may say that. God's not done with you. God's not done with you. If you think the situation is hopeless, that doesn't mean God does. And no situation is hopeless. Here's the key. Here's the mistaken identity. And we'll kind of wind this down with this. Yeah, I told you I had no step 1, 2, 3 for you today, all right? 3 easy steps to recognizing God. That would have been good, but I didn't do it, all right? Put my glasses on because I don't want to miss this. Here we go, all right? Then God says, go out and stand on the mountain in the Lord's presence. He had traveled all the way from up Mount Carmel, way up above around the Sea of Galilee area. And he had traveled way past Jerusalem, the Dead Sea, and down to Mount Horeb or to Mount Sinai. What happened at Mount Sinai? Where Moses was given the covenant, was given the Ten Commandments. It's where God spoke in a mighty way. It's a very special place. And he ends up there, to the very back to where the covenant began and where things begin to happen and where God has spoken before. And God says, I want you to stand on that mountain. Talk to you. You're going to learn something. There's something you need to know. What is it? What is God doing in Elijah's life? All right? At that mountain, here, you know this story, I think, but if not, it's so fascinating. At that moment, when he stood where God told him to stand, the Lord passed by. The Lord passed by. That's not something small. God's presence was there. Now, God had been speaking to him. He had sent angels to him. He was obviously working the situation, but the very presence of God was going to walk by that place where he stood. All right? He's there hiding out in this cave, in a mountain, all alone still, far away from home, out of the situation, but no good situation to walk back into. And in that moment, the Lord walked by, and here's what's fascinating. God chose to do this, and I think there's something we can learn from it, and Elijah needed to learn from it. It said at that moment when God walked by, a great and mighty wind was tearing at the mountain and was shattering the cliffs before the Lord. Imagine that. Well, you could do some cinematography, whatever. The Lord's presence is walking by Elijah, and literally the cliff is just tearing apart. I mean, it's an incredible physical thing that's taking place because God walks by. But here's the important thing, all right? It says, but the Lord was not in the wind. That mighty show, that thing, whatever, that's not what the presence of God was, all right? It doesn't end there. Then it says, after the wind, there was an earthquake. Right? Not an Oklahoma earthquake. Well, I think I felt it. Did you feel it? I think I did. No, okay, we do have an earthquake, California earthquake, all right? An earthquake took place, but the Lord was not in the earthquake, it says. Verse 17, after the earthquake, Wow, think about this. After the earthquake, there was a fire. Okay? Fire, devastating. Fire can be devastating and powerful and scary and all that. A fire came about, but the Lord was not in the fire. So in this situation, here's what we need to see. That in the situation that might seem hopeless, that fear might take over, that we, no matter what we've seen in the past, we can get to that place where we're about ready to give up hope. God is still at work. And God wants to talk to us. And He may use some devastating situations to get our attention. That's not what He has to say. He don't want to say, look what I can do. I can shake this whole planet. I made it. I spoke it into existence. I can shake it all up. All right? I can blow wind like worse than the worst tornado that ever blown through Oklahoma. All right? I can create a fire that's like the fire from hell. That's not what I'm trying to do. But when you listen to me, it gets His attention, and all those things was not what God was about. Here's what God was about. Here's what we can learn, and we can go home. After the fire, finally, it says, after the fire, there was a voice. Soft whisper. God spoke to Elijah in a soft whisper. We call it in a still, small voice. A calming voice. You cannot talk to someone in a whisper unless you've got their attention. Because they have to focus in. Because God's not going to scream it at you. He's not going to yell at you to say, I love you. It's not over. There's hope. I'm still God. Nothing happens unless I say it happens. And whether it's me doing it or the enemy, guess who's in control? All right? And He'll whisper those things to us. What's our lesson to learn? I think that's where I wanted to end it. Don't pack up and go yet, all right? How do you hear that still small voice? Well, after the sound of the wind and the sound of the earthquake and the rocks falling and the sound of crackling fire and all that noise, and then there was that soft voice. You've got to get past the disasters in your life. You've got to turn off the TV. You got to get in a room by yourself if that's what it takes. Now God can do whatever. He can speak to you in the middle of a rock concert loud and clear. So I'm not saying you have to be inside. But do you want to hear God's voice? If you want to hear God's voice, guess what? He wants you to hear it. He goes on to tell Elijah, there's some things you need to do. Your life's not over. And by the way, it wasn't all great stuff. The prophets had a terrible job to tell people God's judgment was coming and that kind of stuff. Part of his job is to go anoint new kings that would not necessarily be great kings, but they had a bunch of bad kings, but there's going to be a little bit of a turnaround. But he also had to go and appoint his replacement, Elisha. You ever got Elijah and Elisha mixed up? Remember, Elijah's the one that went through all this and then tag teamed and said, Elisha, it's yours now. All right? It was over in Elijah's life when God said it was over. Until then, he worked in the situation, through the situation, to do his plan and do his will. God loved Elijah, and he didn't want him to have to go through all that stuff, and he certainly didn't want him to lose hope. But he got his attention. Praise God that he gets our attention and reestablishes his rightful place in our life, beyond the noise, beyond the critics, beyond the enemy, beyond the world, him and you, face to face, him talking to you and reassuring you in a still small voice about your circumstances. And then get this, because it's not always about us, is it? Sometimes he just needs to get our attention beyond us to realize there's other hurting people and there's other situations. And I'm at work in the big picture, and I care about you as well as an individual. Stay with me. Stay with me. Don't let fear lie to you. All right? Let's stand together. Father God, as we come to you right now, even asking you, even in the moment of this invitation, that your still small voice speak to us. And Lord, when it does, we do not hurt us.
heard it. I've heard your voice. And I recognize it from time to time. And then other times I don't hear it because I'm not listening or because I'm listening to the wrong things. So Father, help us to hear you right now. What are you telling me? What are you telling us today? Speak to us. We want to listen. And then help us to do what you ask us to do. We pray this in Jesus' precious name.